a very brief history of illegitimate HIV cures in Africa and look specifically at how it will impact in the future and currently on authentic HIV cure research that is taking place in various parts of the world, including South Africa. So as you all know, we have a huge population of about 52 million people. We have a gross domestic product of around $350 billion US, of which 8.8% is spent on health. And we have a very vibrant clinical trial environment in the country with more than 2,500 clinical trials registered and a number of treatment-naive patients, which makes us a very favorable site for all types of international collaborative research in the country. Regrettably, we have a country that is also well known for its very, very high Gini coefficient. And many of you will know that this is an indication of extreme socioeconomic inequality in a society. And the closer to one we are, the more unequal our society is. And it is unfortunate that many research participants, many members of the public, do come from societies that are vulnerable and that are prone to exploitation by inaccurate reporting and by harmful science. So we have a very huge HIV burden of disease in this country. Almost 6.8 million people who are positive, 340,000 new infections a year, 200,000 deaths from HIV a year. Yet, only 42% of these people are on antiretroviral treatment. I think our discussion around HIV cures in this country dates back to 1997 at least. And the very first story that broke around inauthentic cures revolved around viridine. And viridine, as many of you may know, is an industrial solvent. However, it was tested on 11 patients by 2 cardiothoracic surgeons, and they are named on the slide because this information is in the public domain. So 2 cardiothoracic surgeons at a respected university, the University of Pretoria. This did happen a long time ago, 1997, but raises many, many important questions around institutions of higher learning as producers of knowledge that is usually trusted by civil society, and highly qualified medical practitioners, specialists, scientists who are involved, sadly, in the generation of this type of research. Then, 3 years later, we were all familiar with the debacle around the president, Thabo Mbeki at the time, who, during his tenure, developed an immense distrust of science, the pharmaceutical industry, and Western imposition of imperialism in Africa. And so he put together a team of 30 scientists and pseudoscientists and generated a discussion around HIV cures and HIV and whether the virus itself causes AIDS. What was really interesting was that included in his panel was Professor Peter Duisberg, who was a professor of molecular and cell biology at the University of California, Berkeley at the time, another very well-respected international institution. And of course, while Professor Duisberg had a very good scientific reputation prior to his involvement in the HIV scandal, this is an example of how we can actually look at the disjunction between the type of pseudoscience that emerges from politicians as opposed to the type of pseudoscience that is also supported by highly respected scientists, not only in South Africa, not only in Africa, but indeed internationally. And of course, 3 years later, we know that our own Minister of Health, whom Prof Volmink has referred to earlier, had actually developed a campaign around the support of various vegetables in place of antiretrovirals for the treatment of HIV. Now, at the same time, an interesting fake AIDS cure was also being marketed, and this time it was referred to as umbimbi. It contained 2 indigenous herbs and special salts. And I think it's really important to just notice as we progress through this discussion how the number of herbs actually increases. Of course, combined with these herbs was a treatment involving radiation of patients in a glass box, combined with a drip, an intravenous drip, and they were given an anesthetic, a powerful anesthetic agent called sublimase intramuscular. So, in 2005, South Africa was fertile grounds for various international players to enter into the illegitimate HIV cure arena. Dr. Matthias Rapp was one of them. A German doctor, he had developed a micronutrient cocktail, and he entered the market at exactly the time when patients were being faced with severe side effects from a number of antiretroviral agents. And so there again we had a captive audience waiting for some alternative in terms of HIV treatment. And his position was strengthened by Tina van der Maas, a Dutch nurse. And she is very well known for a concoction that is known as Africa's Solution. We are uncertain whether she saw herself as Africa's solution, as many people do, or whether it was her concoction of African potato, olive green leaf, and grapefruit seed, together with 2 cloves of garlic and the well-known Pro-Neutral, which was marketed as the solution for Africa's HIV problem. In particular, AZT Iabulala clearly speaks to the danger that she was creating around the regular antiretrovirals that were being used at the time. So, to move from all those different events to the University of Cape Town again, another very well-respected institution of higher education. This time it was Dr. Cardwell, head of medical virology in the Institute of Infectious Diseases and Molecular Medicine, who had been experimenting with Secomed V, a plant extract. And we all know that 2 patients died of liver failure as a result of using this particular so-called cure for HIV. Cures for HIV have been promoted well beyond the borders of South Africa in a whole host of African countries. We had Nigeria in 1995 with Dr. Abalaka promoting an HIV vaccine. In Zambia in 2000, Dr. Sondashi had developed a formula which he claimed he had used on his son to treat HIV. Interestingly, in 2004 in Tanzania, the National Institute for Medicine Research had a Dr. Malebo who had developed what was known as the Tashak herb. He claimed that 6,000 people had used the herb and that 90 were improving. What was particularly concerning was that he named 2 collaborators, one of which was the CSIR in South Africa and the other the University of Basel in Switzerland. Whether these were actual collaborators or pseudo-collaborators remains to be established. And then, of course, as recently as 2007, the president of the Gambia, President Jammeh, had developed a secret remedy, this time containing 7 herbs. And so you can see we're getting closer and closer to the recipe for Kentucky Fried Chicken. And in this particular case, he claimed he actually administered this treatment to 200 patients and ensured that they also stopped their ARVs before they actually were able to use his particular remedy. Now, way beyond Africa, in 2002 already, this was around the Thabo Mbeki era, an orthopedic surgeon in the USA was using intravenous aloe vera. at a cost of 18,000 US dollars per 2-week treatment. And then, of course, still in the United States, as recently as December 2013, at Iowa State University, Dr. Dong Pyo Han had actually applied for an NIH grant to the value of almost 19 million US dollars, proposing to use rabbit blood to develop an AIDS vaccine. Of course, what we didn't know was that he had already mixed the rabbit blood with blood from HIV-infected patients so that he could use the antibodies to develop his so-called vaccine. And as recently as this year in Natural Medicine, a journal, not Nature Medicine, Natural Medicine, there was a publication on the use of marijuana as HIV medicine. And while the science reported in this particular publication quotes other basic science that is reported in other reputable journals, drawing the conclusion that this particular author, this particular journalist has drawn, has been regarded as highly questionable at this point in time. Now, I think it's very clear that both internationally, but particularly on the African continent, we have a very rich and contentious history surrounding illegitimate HIV cures. And this is regarded as particularly harmful as HIV research advances. We've had a very long history in South Africa, almost 3 decades, of HIV prevention research, HIV treatment research, and now we're on the cusp of HIV cure research. And so many of you may have heard about the Berlin patient, so a gentleman called Timothy Brown, who was HIV positive, developed leukemia, and received a bone marrow transplantation as treatment for his leukemia. And coincidentally, it was established that he subsequently became HIV negative because the donors of the bone marrow transplant actually were HIV resistant. And so, although this is an extremely complex cure, and it is lauded as the first cure for HIV in the world, it is one that is very expensive, highly impractical in our setting, and definitely one that cannot be scaled up very easily in a country with a high burden of HIV/AIDS. You've probably also heard about the Mississippi baby. By the way, this is not the picture of the Mississippi baby because there is no picture of the Mississippi baby available anywhere. But Dr. Debbie Prasad, who was the pediatrician who treated the baby, thought at one stage, as did other colleagues, that they had actually found a way to cure HIV because extremely early treatment of this baby, contrary to routine protocol, turned out to be quite advantageous, especially when the mother decided to stop using the antiretrovirals that were prescribed. So in many ways, the mother of this baby served as part of an experiment to see what would happen if a baby was treated really very early in its life, and whether stopping treatment, which would not be allowed ethically in normal practice, but stopping treatment as a result of non-compliance of the mother actually made it possible for doctors to assess whether the baby had become HIV negative. In this particular case, although the baby initially appeared to have been cured, subsequently the baby started testing HIV positive again. And of course, this case made us realize that even using the word cure in science today is a dangerous word to use, a dangerous thing to do, because we need to be very clear about whether we are talking about cure or whether we are actually talking about remission, which is a term that we are familiar with in cancer. Apart from the Mississippi baby, we also heard recently that there is an HIV baby in South Africa that was also treated very early, where treatment was stopped, and 9 years later, the child appears to be healthy and free of HIV. Again, the identity of this child has not been revealed on ethical grounds, and this might very well be the first case of a cure in South Africa. And if it is not a cure, then it's an example of a very long period of remission where HIV is concerned. And so a number of articles are starting to emerge in the international literature relating to various strategies that are being employed to actually attempt to cure HIV. And when a number of different strategies are trialed in experimental ways, and clinical trials are actually established in various countries, then it becomes important for scientists to engage with the public and in an attempt to recruit participants for these various clinical trials. Now, given that these are going to be experimental interventions to a large extent, the use of the word cure is problematic if we think about consent processes and consent documents that participants often sign before they take part in studies. However, given the history of illegitimate cures in South Africa, we can only imagine that it will be extremely challenging to engage with participants about a possible cure in the form of new developments, new interventions, and new clinical trials as we go forward. So clearly, scientists have a great deal of work to do in engaging with the public. And science translation is absolutely critical to this endeavor, because we all know that the language of science is complex. The language of HIV/AIDS is extremely complex. But when we start talking about HIV cure strategies, the technology, the terminology becomes so difficult that it is really quite difficult to explain in lay terms. However, we need, as scientists, to become more competent in terms of how we translate our very complex science into language that ordinary people can understand. Of course, we also have the challenge of very vulnerable populations, as I alluded to at the beginning of my presentation, and that consent processes traditionally have been challenging for even basic research. So when we start talking about research for hypertension or diabetes, consent processes are difficult, especially when we speak to a science-naive population. So we need to be prepared for how we will engage with the public in terms of translating the very important knowledge around HIV cure. I think what is really important is that research ethics committees that ought to be independent and regulatory agencies that ought to be independent play a very prominent role in protecting research participants. And there is often a war that develops between scientists and regulators and research ethics committees at various parts of the world, and South Africa is certainly included. And I think where discussions around pseudoscience and quackery are concerned, many of the examples that I quoted earlier on, research at the University of Pretoria, research at the University of Cape Town, so prominent institutions, those bits of research happened because they were not submitted to a research ethics committee. And so you can see the value that there is in having an independent body that looks out for the best interests of research participants when we indulge in the world of science. And so I think this is an area that we need to look at more closely, and sometimes it's important for scientists to see the Research Ethics Committee as a friend rather than as an enemy. In particular, it protects both scientists and institutions from the dangers of pseudoscience and reckless research, and ultimately it protects research participants from harm, especially where irresponsible science can occur. And so it is interesting that the Science Council of Japan in 2013 developed a code of conduct for scientists. I think it's an excellent example, and one that the rest of the world needs to look at, because as scientists, we carry a huge responsibility in terms of the knowledge that we generate, in terms of the messages that we send out to the public, and in terms of the new drugs and new technologies that we develop and make available to the public. Ultimately, these are excellent innovations, provided they do not cause harm. So at that point, I'm going to thank you and introduce our next speaker.